the arrest that would shake the world. But if it ever happened, the consequences would be far more real and far more dangerous than most people realize. This would not be just another regime change moment or a regional intervention in Latin America. To understand why, we must first understand what global order really means, and why Maduro, despite leading a sanctioned and isolated country, sits at the center of a much larger geopolitical fault line. The modern global order is built on a fragile agreement. States do not openly seize or arrest the sitting leaders of other sovereign states. This rule is not written in stone, but it is deeply embedded in international law, diplomatic norms, and the fear of escalation. Even during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union fought proxy wars across the globe, both sides largely avoided directly capturing each other as leaders. The reason was simple. Once that line is crossed, no leader anywhere is truly safe. For decades, the United States treated Latin America as its sphere of influence. But even within that framework, outright capture of a head of state has been rare and indirect. But as imperial enforcement. From Washington's perspective, Maduro is often framed as a criminal figure, accused of drug trafficking, human rights abuses, and election manipulation. U.S. indictments already exist. But transforming those accusations into an actual capture would blur the line between international justice and unilateral power. Other nations would ask a terrifying question. If the U.S. can do this to Maduro, who is next? The immediate global reaction would be shock, but the long-term impact would be fear. Smaller states, especially those that resist U.S. influence, this would not mean diplomacy or reform, it would mean militarization. Leaders would harden their regimes, crack down internally, and seek stronger security guarantees from rival powers. Moscow and Beijing would not respond immediately with war, but they would respond strategically. International institutions would suffer irreversible damage. The United Nations, already weakened, would be exposed as powerless. And chaos fills the gap. For the Global South, the message would be unmistakable. Sovereignty would appear conditional, not guaranteed. Countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America would reassess their relationships with the United States, not in terms of values, but survival. Many would pivot toward alternative systems, regional blocs, local currencies, and non-Western financial institutions to reduce exposure to U.S. pressure. Ironically, an action intended to reinforce American dominance would accelerate its decline. European nations might publicly support the capture, but privately, they would worry about precedent. Trust between allies relies on predictability, and a world where leaders can be seized across borders is deeply unpredictable. Over time, this would weaken alliance cohesion and increase strategic hedging. Inside Venezuela, the consequences would also be destabilizing. Maduro's capture would not automatically bring democracy or stability. Power vacuums rarely do. Competing factions, military commanders, and foreign interests would rush to fill the void. Civil conflict could erupt, spilling instability across borders into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. Rather than resolving a crisis, the capture could internationalize it. Most importantly, the symbolic impact would outlive the event itself. The image of a US-backed operation capturing a sitting president would become a reference point for decades. It would be cited by future leaders justifying repression, by rival powers justifying aggression, and by movements arguing that international law is a myth. Symbols shape history as much as armies do, and this symbol would be radioactive. The capture of Maduro would not destroy the global order overnight. Instead, it would crack its foundation. Each subsequent crisis would widen those cracks until the system finally collapses under its own contradictions. What replaces it would not be cleaner or more just. It would be harsher, more divided, and far more dangerous. This is why the question is not whether Maduro deserves capture in moral terms. The real question is whether the world can survive the precedent. In the next part, we will examine how this single act could trigger a chain reaction across energy markets, global finance, and military alliances, turning one arrest into a planetary shockwave. The domino effect across the global system. Capturing Nicolás Maduro would not be an isolated political maneuver. It would set off a series of dominoes that could destabilize the entire global system. The first and most immediate impact would be on global energy markets. Venezuela holds more proven oil reserves than any country on the planet, yet sanctions and mismanagement have kept production below its potential. A sudden U.S. operation destabilizing Maduro's government would immediately trigger panic across energy markets, sending oil prices soaring. Traders would respond to uncertainty rather than fundamentals, and even small fluctuations could ripple across the globe, affecting everything from gasoline prices in Europe to heating costs in Asia. The shockwaves would not be temporary, forcing governments, investors, and corporations to rethink energy security entirely. The energy shock would also deepen geopolitical fractures. Europe, which relies heavily on oil and gas imports, would suddenly confront its vulnerability to distant crises. Nations that are already politically divided over energy policy, Germany, France, Italy, would face internal debates about dependency on foreign oil, energy storage, and alternative suppliers. Asian economies, particularly China and India, would view the seizure as a direct threat to their energy supply chains. Beijing, which has invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure and oil agreements, would interpret the operation as a hostile act, not just against Maduro, but against Chinese interests globally. The result would be a rush to secure alternative energy routes and a redoubling of efforts to control resources beyond U.S. reach, from Africa to the Middle East. Financial markets would not escape unscathed. Beyond oil, Venezuela is linked to a web of debt obligations, bonds, and international financial flows. A sudden capture of the president could lead to immediate defaults or suspension of payments on Venezuelan debt. Investors holding Venezuelan or even regional bonds would panic, triggering a contagion effect that could spread across emerging markets. Banks with exposure to Latin America would face liquidity crises, and currency markets would react violently. Latin American currencies could collapse in value overnight, creating conditions for hyperinflation and economic instability in multiple countries. The financial domino effect would be amplified, because investors would now price in political risk not just for Venezuela, but for any country where the U.S. chooses to act unilaterally. Military escalation is another inevitable consequence. Even if the U.S. attempted to present the operation as surgical or lawful, Russia and China would treat it as an existential threat. Both nations have been cultivating influence in Venezuela through arms deals, military advisors, and energy cooperation. While direct confrontation would be unlikely in the immediate term, we would almost certainly see an increase in arms transfers to Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. These transfers would be paired with more aggressive military exercises, naval deployments, and intelligence operations aimed at countering perceived U.S. overreach. The capture of Maduro would thus transform a localized operation into a global security dilemma where every country feels compelled to escalate defensively. The crisis would also accelerate the fragmentation of international institutions. The United Nations, already criticized for its inability to enforce global law uniformly, would be exposed as irrelevant. If a permanent member of the Security Council can seize a sitting president of another country without authorization, the UN's foundational principle of sovereignty becomes meaningless. Regional organizations like the Organization of American States, OAS, would struggle to maintain legitimacy. The perception of selective enforcement of international law would lead countries to bypass global institutions entirely, creating a world where bilateral power and raw influence dictate outcomes rather than agreed-upon rules. Humanitarian consequences would be immediate and severe. While some might assume that Maduro's removal would lead to stability, history suggests otherwise. The power vacuum could ignite a struggle between military factions, opposition leaders, and foreign interests, leading to violence, refugee flows, and economic collapse. Neighboring countries, Colombia, Brazil, and Caribbean nations, would bear the brunt of the instability, potentially facing millions of refugees and increased security threats. Humanitarian organizations would be overwhelmed, and international aid could become politicized, undermining trust and exacerbating regional tensions. The precedent of capturing a sitting head of state would also reshape global diplomacy. Smaller nations would revise their foreign policy strategies to prioritize survival over cooperation. States in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East would likely pursue self-sufficiency in military capabilities, cyber defense, and energy security. Many would seek to diversify alliances, forming coalitions that operate outside of Western-dominated structures. This could include a surge in non-Western financial institutions, regional trade agreements, and defense pacts designed to circumvent the influence of the United States. In effect, the capture of Maduro could accelerate the transition from a unipolar or even multipolar world dominated by Western norms to a fragmented system where spheres of influence are sharply divided and unpredictable. The psychological impact on leaders and populations cannot be overstated. Leaders would perceive that no one is immune to unilateral action, creating a climate of paranoia. Decision-making would become increasingly risk-averse, defensive, and secretive. Trust between countries would erode, as each action would be scrutinized for hidden threats. For ordinary citizens, the sense of stability associated with international law and predictable diplomacy would disappear, replaced by anxiety over what the next U.S. operation might target. This erosion of trust is a silent but powerful form of systemic destabilization, which, combined with economic shocks and military escalation, could set the stage for decades of instability. The technological dimension would also come into play. Cybersecurity threats, information warfare, and strategic disinformation would accelerate in response to the capture. Rival states would use the incident as justification for cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure, financial institutions, and allied networks. The weaponization of information would extend beyond traditional state actors, as non-state groups and proxies exploit the chaos to further their own agendas. The digital dimension, often underestimated, amplifies the impact of such geopolitical shocks and ensures that the consequences of one event are felt across borders and sectors almost instantly. Finally, the capture would alter global perceptions of law, justice, and morality. If a nation like the United States can bypass international norms to seize a head of state, the very concept of sovereignty becomes a tactical choice rather than a principle. Future interventions, whether in Asia, the Middle East, or Africa, would be judged less by legal frameworks and more by raw power dynamics. Over time, this would weaken global cooperation, encourage opportunistic behavior, and make the world inherently more unstable. In other words, the capture of Maduro would not merely be a political maneuver, it would mark the beginning of a structural transformation, one where fear, power, and chaos dominate the international landscape. In conclusion, the U.S. capture of Nicolás Maduro would trigger a global chain reaction affecting energy, finance, military strategy, diplomacy, humanitarian systems, technology, and international norms. What might initially appear as a tactical victory could quickly escalate into a systemic crisis, one that undermines decades of carefully constructed global order. The real danger lies not in the arrest itself, but in the ripple effects it sets off, a domino effect across multiple dimensions that could redefine the rules of global engagement for generations to come. In Part 3, we will explore how specific nations and alliances would respond to this shock, revealing the pathways through which the world could spiral into unprecedented instability. Global alliances and the spiral into chaos. The capture of Nicolás Maduro would send shockwaves through international alliances in ways that few analysts can fully predict. Global powers would be forced to respond, not just out of principle, but out of necessity. Countries like Russia and China, whose influence in Latin America has steadily grown over the last decade, would immediately view the operation as a direct challenge to their strategic interests. Moscow, with its military and intelligence ties in Venezuela, would likely accelerate deployments in both the Western Hemisphere and Eastern Europe to counter what it perceives as unchecked U.S. assertiveness. Beijing, on the other hand, would view the incident as a warning about vulnerability, potentially shifting even more investments in military support to nations outside U.S. influence, from Africa to Central Asia. The message is clear. Unilateral action against a sovereign state by a superpower rewrites the rules of engagement for the entire globe. NATO and European nations would face a precarious dilemma. On one hand, they may publicly support the U.S. operation, framing it as the removal of a dictator accused of crimes against his own people. Yet privately, the alliance would grapple with the dangerous precedent this sets. If the capture of Maduro is accepted internationally, what stops a future U.S. administration from taking similar actions in other regions where Europe has vested interests? Trust among allies relies on predictability and shared norms. Once those norms are violated, coordination becomes fragile, and strategic hesitancy replaces decisive action. Europe's response would likely split along political lines, creating further divisions within NATO and weakening the alliance's cohesion just when global tensions demand unity. Latin America itself would enter a state of upheaval. Countries neighboring Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean nations would face immediate security challenges. Refugee flows would surge, smuggling networks could expand, and the threat of civil unrest spilling across borders would rise. Regional blocs like Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance would struggle to formulate a coordinated response, with some nations calling for condemnation of the U.S. action and others advocating cautious neutrality. The risk of proxy conflicts increases when regional governments see the vacuum as an opportunity to assert influence, while criminal networks exploit instability for profit. For decades, Latin America has been a testing ground for U.S. influence, but this operation could transform it into a region defined by uncertainty and escalating crises. The financial ramifications of the capture would continue to ripple through global markets. Investors would quickly reassess risk, not just in Latin America, but worldwide. Emerging markets with any U.S. exposure would experience volatility as traders price in the potential for similar interventions elsewhere. Commodity markets, particularly oil and natural gas, would remain unstable for years as the sudden disruption of Venezuelan production forces global economies to scramble for alternatives. Even developed markets would not be immune. Supply chain disruptions could affect industries from automotive to energy-intensive manufacturing, creating inflationary pressures that reverberate through domestic economies and global trade networks alike. Small and medium-sized powers across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East would interpret the U.S. action as a cautionary tale. Sovereignty would be seen as conditional, forcing nations to reconsider their defense, energy, and economic policies. Many would accelerate military modernization programs, invest in cybersecurity capabilities, and deepen partnerships with alternative powers outside Western spheres of influence. Multilateral institutions, long considered arbiters of international norms, would face declining relevance. Countries would increasingly prioritize bilateral deals and regional alliances over global agreements, potentially fragmenting established systems like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and even climate frameworks. The capture of a single leader, in effect, becomes a catalyst for the erosion of a globally coordinated order. Meanwhile, global public opinion would polarize dramatically. For some, the operation would be celebrated as a triumph of justice, the removal of a tyrant who has oppressed his people and destabilized his nation. For others, it would represent a dangerous overreach, an act of imperial arrogance that ignores sovereignty, international law, and long-term consequences. The debate would not remain academic. Public sentiment would influence elections, drive protests, and shape foreign policy in countries far removed from Venezuela, as nations and populations become increasingly suspicious of each other's motives. Cyber and information warfare would also intensify in the aftermath of the capture. Rival states and non-state actors would exploit the chaos to attack financial institutions, critical infrastructure, and government networks around the world, further complicating diplomatic efforts. The event would serve as a precedent that encourages other nations to take bold, aggressive actions under the guise of national interest, effectively normalizing what was once considered unacceptable behavior in international relations. In short, the digital dimension ensures that the consequences of Maduro-esque capture are not confined to Latin America. They are felt instantly on a global scale. Humanitarian crises would compound the political and economic turmoil. Food and medical supply chains would collapse, and the fragile health and social systems would be stretched to the breaking point. Refugees would pour into neighboring countries, the principles that once governed international law, sovereignty, non-intervention, and collective security would be shattered. States would act based on survival rather than shared norms. Alliances would be transactional rather than principled, and conflict would become more likely, not less. Would instead mark the beginning of a cascading series of crises that threaten to destabilize nations, economies, and populations across the globe. It would force nations to rethink strategy, survival, and sovereignty in ways that could permanently alter the global landscape. Reshaping the rules of power, trust, and diplomacy worldwide. The era of predictable international conduct could end in an instant. This is the stark reality behind a hypothetical operation that, while perhaps unlikely, serves as a warning. Understanding the broader implications is crucial, not only for policymakers, but for anyone trying to grasp the forces shaping our increasingly interconnected and volatile world. The capture of a single leader is never just about that leader. It is about the signal it sends, the reactions it triggers. If you found this analysis eye-opening, hit the notification bell so you never miss a breakdown of the events that could alter history forever.